In the summer of 1867, in a quiet farming community near Sedalia, Missouri, 8-year-old Timothy Caldwell became the center of one of the strangest and most unsettling medical cases ever recorded in the Midwest. Dr. Samuel Harding, the area's only physician, would go on to fill 3 leather-bound journals with his observations of a child who seemed to defy every principle of human nature that 19th century medicine understood. At first glance, Timothy looked like any other boy, polite, even charming, but there was something beneath the surface that no one could quite explain. Over the next 6 months, 3 people died in bizarre accidents around him, and dozens of farm animals turned up dead under mysterious circumstances. 11 people, in one way or another, would cross paths with a boy whose gentle smile never seemed to reach his pale blue eyes. Local authorities eventually sealed the records and kept them hidden for more than a century. But the story that survives reveals something much darker, something that forces us to question just how early in life true evil can emerge. Before we dive into Timothy's story and the fear that swept through Sedalia County, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our deep dives into America's most chilling historical mysteries. And tell us in the comments what state or city you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Timothy's story didn't begin with violence. It began with loss. Missouri in 1867 was still bleeding from the wounds of the Civil War. Towns like Sedalia had sent their young men off to die on distant battlefields, leaving behind widows, orphans, and farms struggling to survive. The Caldwell farm, about 15 miles south of town, had once been prosperous. James and Martha Caldwell had worked hard to build their homestead and dreamed of raising cattle and corn, but James never returned from the Battle of Wilson's Creek in 1861, and Martha died of consumption during the brutal winter of 1865. Their son Thomas, barely 21, inherited land he couldn't manage and debts he couldn't pay. When word came that his brother William had died at Andersonville prison, leaving behind a widow and an 8-year-old boy, Thomas saw both a burden and a solution. The boy would need a home, and Thomas needed another pair of hands on the farm. Thomas was a hard man, shaped by war and loss, and his wife Sarah had grown sharp-tongued and bitter during her childless years. Neither seemed well-suited for raising a child, especially a boy who showed up in the spring of 1866 with nothing but a small cloth bag and eyes that seemed far too old for his face. Timothy was small for his age, pale, with blonde hair Sarah kept cut short to avoid lice. He rarely spoke about his life before the farm. When pressed, he would say only that his father had been a soldier, his mother had coughed blood, and that he had stayed with neighbors for a while after she died. What struck most adults was his politeness. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. No complaining, no backtalk, never shirking chores or resisting punishment. By all appearances, he was a perfect child. Dr. Harding first met Timothy in June 1866, when the boy came into town with his uncle, Harding, a graduate of the Missouri Medical College and one of the few formally trained doctors west of St. Louis, had treated both Union and Confederate soldiers and prided himself on being a good judge of character. Something about the boy put him on edge. Harding later wrote in his journal, "The child was perfectly respectful. He answered my questions plainly, kept good eye contact, and displayed none of the fidgeting common in rural children meeting a stranger. And yet, I found myself deeply uncomfortable. His gaze was not that of a child. It was as if he were studying me with the same detached interest I usually reserve for my patients." Neighbors soon began to notice things as well. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who lived next door, often saw Timothy working in the fields or tending livestock. She told her husband that the boy never seemed to play or even rest. He just worked, sunrise to sunset, like a little machine. She also noticed her chickens became restless whenever Timothy was nearby, huddling together and refusing to approach the fence line. Her husband dismissed it as superstition, but Mrs. Patterson couldn't shake the feeling that the animals sensed something the humans did not. The first tragedy struck on a sweltering afternoon in August 1866. Little Mary Fletcher, just 5 years old, was known throughout the community for her bright laugh and wandering spirit. That day, she had been playing near Willow Creek, a shallow stream that passed behind several farms, including the Caldwells. It was Timothy who brought the news. He appeared at the Fletcher home just before supper, his clothes damp, his face pale but calm. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said evenly, "I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." The search party rushed the creek and found Mary face down in water barely 18 inches deep. Dr. Harding confirmed that she had drowned, a tragic but not uncommon accident in rural Missouri. And yet, something about Timothy's story of how he'd found her didn't sit right with the doctor. Timothy's story of finding Mary Fletcher was unusually precise for a frightened 8-year-old. He described exactly where she had been lying, how her dress had snagged on a branch beneath the water, even the way the creek water had pooled darkly around her face. When Dr. Harding pressed him on why he had been near the creek at that exact moment, Timothy explained that he had been looking for a missing calf. His recall, Harding noted later, was remarkably detailed for a child his age. 2 days later, the calf was found alive and well, grazing nearly a mile away from where Mary had drowned. The Fletchers were grateful to Timothy for alerting them so quickly, and at the funeral he sat with his aunt and uncle, head bowed, quiet and respectful. When Mary's grieving father thanked him, Timothy replied softly, "I just wish I had found her sooner." His words sounded sincere enough, but Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, watching from across the church, noticed something that stayed with her. When Mary's mother collapsed in grief, when grown men wept at the sight of the tiny coffin, Timothy's expression never truly changed. His head was bowed, but his pale blue eyes were dry and watchful, as though he were studying the scene, not mourning it. 3 weeks later, tragedy struck again. Henrik Larsson, an aging Norwegian immigrant known for tending wild beehives near Devil Bluff, was found dead at the bottom of the rocky outcrop that overlooked Willow Creek. His neck had been broken in what appeared to be a fatal fall. Once again, it was Timothy who found him. "I saw Mr. Larson's hat caught in a bush," he told the gathering neighbors. "I called out, but he didn't answer, so I climbed down to look." Dr. Harding confirmed that death had been instantaneous. The only odd thing about the scene was the number of dead bees scattered around Larson's body. Far too many to be natural. "Henrik knew those bluffs better than any man in the county," Samuel Patterson remarked. "He's been climbing them for years. Never so much as slipped. Makes no sense he'd fall now." Timothy suggested that perhaps Larson had been stung and lost his footing. He was always saying how angry the bees get when you disturb them. Maybe they swarmed him and he panicked. Harding found the explanation plausible, but something didn't add up. The hives at the top of the bluff were untouched, calm, undisturbed. There should have been signs of a swarm along the path of Larson's fall. Instead, the dead bees were clustered only at the spot where his body had landed. The third death erased any remaining doubts about coincidence. In September 1866, 6-year-old Jacob Mills vanished while playing near the woods by his family's cabin. A frantic search began, and Timothy, now a familiar figure in such tragedies, joined the searchers. He showed an uncanny knowledge of the terrain, guiding grown men through hidden trails even longtime locals didn't know. On the 4th day, Timothy appeared at the Mills cabin just after dawn, pale and exhausted. "I think I found something," he said. "There's an old well about half a mile north. I heard something like crying." Jacob was indeed at the bottom of the well, barely alive. He was pulled out and carried home, but despite Dr. Harding's efforts, the child died within hours, too weak to recover after 4 days without food or water. Harding's journal entry that night was grim. How did Timothy Caldwell know exactly where to look? What child explores so far into the woods and remembers every hidden well and thicket? More disturbing to Harding was what he witnessed as Jacob lay dying. The Mills family wept and prayed at the boy's bedside, but Timothy sat in the corner, lips moving silently. To anyone else, he looked as though he were praying too. But Harding, watching carefully, saw something else. Timothy's eyes were not closed. They were locked on Jacob, studying him with cold, clinical interest, as though committing every stage of death to memory. And when Jacob finally slipped away, Timothy's face did not twist with grief. Instead, Harding wrote, there was an unmistakable flicker of satisfaction. Dr. Harding couldn't get the well out of his mind. A few days after Jacob's funeral, he returned to the site where the boy had been found. Something about the place unsettled him. Though he couldn't quite explain why, the well was deeply hidden, covered in fallen branches and brush that would have taken real effort to arrange. And yet Timothy had claimed to hear crying from that spot. As Harding examined the area more carefully, he noticed something the rescue party had overlooked in their rush to save Jacob. The debris around the rim wasn't random. The branches and logs looked as if they'd been placed there deliberately, almost artfully, to disguise the well's opening. The implication made Harding's stomach turn. Jacob Mills might not have simply fallen. Someone could have put him there, then camouflaged the well to ensure he wouldn't be found until it was too late. That night, Harding began keeping detailed notes about Timothy Caldwell. If his suspicions were right, the boy wasn't just unlucky, he was dangerous. But suspicion wasn't proof, and that was a problem. Timothy was, by every outward measure, the picture of a well-raised child. He sat quietly through church, recited prayers with perfect reverence, worked tirelessly on the farm, and spoke respectfully to every adult he met. He even had a reasonable explanation for being present at each tragedy, searching for a lost calf, walking home from town, volunteering to help with the search party. Still, Harding's years as a war doctor had taught him to look beyond appearances. He had treated soldiers who killed not out of necessity, but out of something darker, men who seemed strangely calm in the face of death, almost fascinated by it. Timothy showed those same signs, but in the body of an 8-year-old boy. Harding's quiet investigation began in October 1866. Under the guise of routine medical rounds, he visited farms across the county, quietly asking questions about Timothy. What he found disturbed him. Livestock deaths were unusually common near the Caldwell farm, not from disease, but from strange accidents. Chickens were found with their necks broken, yet there were no fox tracks or signs of struggle. Pigs suffered deep wounds that turned septic, forcing farmers to kill them. Horses went suddenly lame and had to be put down. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson confided that she had lost 17 chickens in just 2 months. It's the strangest thing, she told him. They're always found in the morning with their necks broken, clean. My husband swears it's foxes, but there's never any other sign of attack. And it's too neat. Foxes don't kill like that. When Harding examined the carcasses himself, he was chilled by what he saw. The breaks were precise, applied with exactly the right amount of force at exactly the right spot. It was too careful to be a predator. It looked almost deliberate. Other farmers told similar stories. Calves strangled on ropes that had been tied safely the night before. A prize bull found with a broken leg after falling into a ditch it had never stumbled near before. And time after time, neighbors recalled seeing Timothy nearby on the day of the accidents. Saw him walking the fence line that morning, said James Wickham. Thought it was strange he was so far from home. But he waved, called me sir, polite as ever. Harding also began to watch Timothy more closely during his regular visits to the Caldwell farm. The boy was always present, standing silently while Harding examined his aunt and uncle. But what struck the doctor was how intently Timothy observed the procedures, asking pointed questions about anatomy and medicine that seemed far too advanced for his age. How do you know if someone's really dead? Timothy asked one afternoon, his tone casual, as though he were asking about the weather. Sometimes people just look like they're sleeping. When Harding pressed him on why he wanted to know, Timothy replied that he just wanted to be prepared. Uncle Thomas says, I need to know what to do if someone gets hurt. We live so far from town. It was a reasonable answer, but the way Timothy asked, calm, curious, almost clinical, left Harding uneasy. The boy's fascination didn't stop at first aid. He asked how long it took to die from certain injuries, what signs to look for, whether people could survive being stabbed, shot, or crushed. He asked it all with the calm, focused interest of a medical student, not a child. Harding began slipping deliberate falsehoods into his explanations, telling Timothy that certain injuries were fatal when they weren't, or that certain symptoms meant something they didn't. Timothy never argued, but Harding could see that he remembered every word, storing the information away. What disturbed Harding most was Timothy's reaction when he told stories about treating wounded soldiers, where most children looked horrified or saddened. Timothy didn't just listen when Harding spoke about battlefield injuries. He absorbed every word. He asked detailed questions about wound patterns, blood loss, and survival times. "Did they scream a lot when you cut off their arms?" he asked one day, his pale blue eyes fixed on Harding's face. "Or were they too hurt to make any noise?" The question was delivered with the same calm politeness as always, but it sent a chill through Harding that he would never forget. By November 1866, Dr. Harding had filled nearly 2 entire journals with notes about Timothy Caldwell. The picture that emerged was terrifying, a child with an adult's understanding of violence and death, but none of the empathy that should have come with it. But notes weren't evidence, and evidence was what Harding needed if he had any hope of protecting the community. That chance came when Thomas Caldwell injured his back during the harvest. The injury left him bedridden for weeks, giving Harding daily access to the Caldwell household, and crucially, to Timothy. During these visits, Harding deliberately engaged the boy in longer conversations, carefully probing for clues about the extent of his knowledge and the nature of his thoughts. What he learned was worse than anything he had imagined. Through cautious questioning and quiet observation, Harding discovered that Timothy had been conducting experiments on living creatures for months, maybe years. The breakthrough came when Timothy casually mentioned a cave he liked to visit to think and be alone. When Harding investigated, what he found chilled him to the bone. A carefully arranged collection of animal bones, crude surgical instruments fashioned from farm tools, and drawings, dozens of them, meticulously detailed, showing animals in various stages of torture and dissection. The drawings were horrifyingly precise. Each was accompanied by neat, careful notes in Timothy's handwriting, documenting the animal's reactions, the length of its suffering, and the exact moment of death. Subject remained conscious for approximately 10 minutes after removal of eyes. Read one note beside the image of a rabbit. Vocalizations decreased gradually. Movement ceased after pressure applied to throat. It was then that Harding understood the accidental livestock deaths on nearby farms had been Timothy's experiments on larger and larger animals. But what froze Harding's blood were the newer drawings. These no longer depicted animals. They depicted people. One showed a figure that was unmistakably Mary Fletcher, annotated with observations about drowning. Another was Henrik Larsson, with notes speculating about the effects of blunt force trauma from a fall. A third showed Jacob Mills at the bottom of the well, complete with detailed calculations about dehydration and exposure. Timothy hadn't merely been present at each tragedy. He had planned them, executed them, and documented the results for future study. And Harding knew, with grim certainty, that the horror in Sedalia County was far from over. At this point, Harding faced a terrible dilemma. The cave was undeniable proof of Timothy's guilt, but legally, it was evidence obtained by trespass. And even if it had been admissible, who in 1866 would believe that an 8-year-old boy was a calculating murderer? 19th century medicine had no words for psychopathy or sociopathy. Children, according to prevailing belief, were born innocent, corrupted only by bad influences or trauma. The idea of a child born without empathy, capable of coldly premeditated murder, was simply unthinkable. If Harding went to the authorities, he would be dismissed as a doctor whose mind had been warped by years of treating battlefield carnage. Timothy would be defended as a grieving orphan, and the killings would continue. So Harding made a fateful choice. He would confront the boy himself. On his next visit, he asked Timothy to walk with him to check the livestock in the far pasture. When they were alone, Harding told him everything he had found in the cave, the bones, the tools, the drawings. Timothy didn't flinch. He didn't deny anything. He didn't even look afraid. He simply listened. Occasionally, he nodded, as if confirming Harding's observations. "You're not going to tell anyone," Timothy said when Harding finished. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement, calm, certain, absolute. "Why wouldn't I?" Harding asked, genuinely curious. For the first time, Timothy smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "Because no one would believe you," he said, "and because you want to see what I'll do next." Timothy was right on both counts. Harding knew his story would sound like the ravings of a man going mad, and worse. He couldn't deny the truth of what Timothy had just said. Deep down, there was a part of him that was curious. A scientist's curiosity, dark, unwilling, but undeniable. "How long have you?" Harding began. "How long have you been doing this?" Dr. Harding asked quietly. "Since I was 5, Timothy replied matter-of-factly. "Maybe earlier. I started with insects, then mice, then bigger things." He tilted his head, as though explaining a school project. "It's interesting to see how different animals react to the same treatments. And the people who died." Timothy shrugged, almost casual. "They were experiments too. I wanted to see if people would react the same way as animals. Mostly they do, but they know what's happening to them. That makes it more interesting." A chill passed through Dr. Harding that had nothing to do with the November air. "What are you planning to do next?" Timothy actually thought about it before answering. "I need to find out what happens when you hurt someone who trusts you completely," he said. "Someone who wouldn't suspect anything until it was too late." The meaning was unmistakable. Timothy was planning to kill his aunt and uncle. Harding felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had days, maybe only hours, before Timothy acted. The boy had spoken with the calm assurance of someone who never hesitated once he chose a course of action. That evening, Harding went to Sedalia to speak with Sheriff William Crawford. Crawford was a blunt, practical man, a former Union officer who had seen his share of human darkness, and who trusted Harding's judgment. The doctor presented his case carefully, sticking to facts. The cave, the drawings, the pattern of deaths, Timothy's disturbing knowledge of anatomy, and finally, the boy's open admission that he intended to kill. Crawford's face hardened as he studied the evidence. "Even if half of this is true," he said finally, "we can't arrest a child over sketches and suspicions, but we can watch him and be ready to act." Together, they devised a plan. Harding would visit the Caldwell farm as usual, bringing laudanum under the pretense of pain treatment, but in truth to keep Thomas and Sarah sedated and therefore safe. Crawford and his most trusted former soldiers would take positions around the property, close enough to intervene, but far enough not to spook the boy. The plan was set for the following morning, but as Harding approached the farmhouse, he knew at once that something was wrong. The usual sounds of farm life were gone. No chickens in the yard, no pigs grunting. The air felt unnaturally still. Timothy appeared in the doorway before Harding even climbed down from the buggy. He stood perfectly still, his pale blue eyes tracking Harding's movements with predatory intensity. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and his hands looked freshly scrubbed, as though preparing for work that might get messy. "Good morning, Dr. Harding," Timothy said politely. But beneath the politeness was something new, a tremor of excitement he could barely contain. "I've been waiting for you." The words made Harding's skin crawl. He suddenly wondered if the boy had anticipated this visit, perhaps even orchestrated it. Inside, he found Thomas and Sarah Caldwell lying motionless in their bed, breathing but unnaturally pale. Harding checked Thomas's pulse. "Weak but steady. What did you give them?" Harding asked without looking back. "Just some herbs I found in the woods," Timothy answered lightly. "There are so many interesting plants out there. Some of them have very useful properties." Sarah was also alive, though deeply unconscious. Timothy had been careful with his dosage. He wanted them helpless, but alive. They won't wake up for hours. Timothy said conversationally. That should give us plenty of time to talk. What followed was the most disturbing conversation of Harding's life. Timothy spoke of murder as if delivering a lecture. He described his experiments in detail, explaining how he'd measured pain, noted breathing patterns, timed how long it took for each victim to die. Mary Fletcher taught me that drowning is actually quite slow, Timothy said, settling into a chair as though beginning a pleasant chat. Everyone thinks people just slip under the water and vanish. But that's not how it works at all. There's struggling, gasping, this interesting pattern of breathing before they finally give up. He smiled faintly. I had to hold her down for almost 3 minutes before she stopped fighting. Harding felt the blood drain from his face. You held her under yourself? Timothy nodded eagerly. She was playing by the creek. I told her I'd found a pretty stone. When she bent to look, I just pushed her head under and held it. She fought harder than I thought she would. That's when I realized people have much stronger survival instincts than animals. And Henrik Larsson? Harding asked, his voice barely steady. Timothy's expression turned almost thoughtful. That one was more complicated, he said, and began to explain. I couldn't overpower him physically, Timothy said, his voice calm, almost proud. So I had to be more creative. I knew he checked his beehives every Thursday morning. The night before, I loosened the stones along the bluff's edge and collected bees from one of his hives, putting them in a cloth bag. When Mr. Len came up the hill, I was waiting. I threw the bag at his face and screamed that there was a swarm attacking him. He panicked, just like I knew he would, and stumbled backward over the edge where I'd weakened the stones. The fall killed him instantly. Timothy's pale eyes gleamed with satisfaction. And Jacob Mills, Timothy's tone shifted as though sharing his favorite discovery. He was the most interesting of all. I didn't want to kill him quickly like the others. I wanted to see what happens when someone dies slowly, over days, not minutes. I told him I found a family of baby raccoons, and he followed me into the woods without question. I helped him climb down into the well. Then I covered the opening with logs and brush. I visited every day, giving him just enough water to keep him alive, but not enough to let him get strong. For days. Timothy's voice was almost dreamy. It took 4 days. Dr. Harding's hands tightened on his medical bag. What are you planning to do with your aunt and uncle? He asked. Timothy smiled, a wide, genuine smile that made Harding's blood run cold. That's where you come in, doctor. All my other subjects never knew what was happening until it was too late. But you know exactly what I am. That makes you the perfect subject for a new kind of experiment. As he spoke, Timothy moved around the room with chilling purpose, collecting rope, a candlestick, several sharp knives, arranging them neatly on the table like surgical tools. I want to see what happens when someone who knows they're going to die tries to save the people they love. Do you fight me? Do you sacrifice yourself? Or do you run and leave them behind? Harding's pulse pounded. The time for words was over. He drew the Navy Colt from his medical bag and leveled it at the boy. Step away from the knives, Timothy. The boy looked at the gun with fascination. That's a Navy Colt, isn't it? 6 shots. Harding cursed himself for answering automatically. 6 shots, 6 people. Timothy said softly. Yourself, my aunt and uncle, the 3 men outside. Even if you shoot me, you'll have nothing left when the others come for you. He took a step closer, utterly unafraid. You want to know how I became this way, he said, almost hypnotic now. You want to know if I was born like this, or if something made me this way. You want to know if there are others like me, and how to spot them before they start killing. Every word was true, and Harding knew it. Then Timothy moved toward the bed, rope in hand. Harding stepped forward, but the boy was fast, frighteningly fast. He slashed Harding's arm with a hidden knife, and the room erupted into chaos. The struggle was brief, violent, and brutal. Timothy fought like a cornered animal, striking with precision born of practice. Harding managed to wrench the knife from his hand. only for Timothy to pull another blade from his clothing. The sound of the fight brought Sheriff Crawford and his deputies crashing through the back door. Within moments, Deputy Mitchell had the boy pinned, tying his wrist with rope as Harding checked the unconscious Caldwells. When it was over, Timothy sat calmly in the corner, blood on his face, his pale eyes still bright with that unsettling intelligence. "You can't prove anything," he said softly. "Nobody will ever believe a child did all of this." Sheriff Crawford looked down at him grimly. "Maybe not, but trying to murder your family is enough to see you locked up, no matter how young you are." Timothy smiled again, that same cold, knowing smile. "You won't hang me," he said with absolute certainty. "I'm too young, too interesting. Someone will want to study me instead." The room went silent. Even Crawford's hardened deputies shivered at the words. The nightmare in Sedalia County wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. Caldwell was wrong about his fate, but right about the impossibility of proving his crimes. When Sheriff Crawford tried to present the cave evidence to the county prosecutors, he met exactly the kind of resistance Dr. Harding had predicted. The drawings and notes were dismissed as the dark fantasies of a traumatized child. The string of deaths and accidents was written off as coincidence, worsened by Timothy's habit of always being present during emergencies. But the attempted murder of Thomas and Sarah Caldwell could not be ignored. 3 witnesses had seen Timothy with the knife in hand. Even the most sympathetic voices admitted that an 8-year-old boy does not try to butcher his family in their sleep unless something inside him is broken. The justice system of 1867 had no precedent for a case like this. Too young for the gallows, too dangerous for an orphanage or reformatory, Timothy became the center of a heated legal and medical debate. After weeks of arguments, Missouri officials struck an uneasy compromise. Timothy would be remanded to Missouri State Hospital for the insane in Fulton to be studied and treated by the best alienists in the region. The decision satisfied no one. Prosecutors wanted him tried as an adult. Defense attorneys claimed no child could truly understand murder. Doctors and scholars traveled from Boston and Philadelphia to witness what many called a case that could redefine childhood. Dr. Samuel Harding personally accompanied Timothy to Fulton and remained for 3 months, meticulously documenting the boy's behavior. His reports would later become one of the first systematic studies of what we now call antisocial personality disorder, though the papers would not be published until decades later. Timothy adapted to the asylum with unnerving ease. He cried on command when asked about his victims, spoke of guilt and redemption with perfect sincerity, and charmed several staff members into believing he was making extraordinary progress. But Harding saw through the act. "Timothy is not recovering," he wrote. "He is studying. He is cataloging human behavior with precision, learning how to mimic emotion, but never feeling it. Happiness to him is merely the face people make when they wish a pleasure to continue. Sadness is the face they make when they want sympathy. He understands the signals, not the feelings." The illusion collapsed completely when Timothy, believing it earned Harding's trust, began sharing ideas for future experiments. What he described made his earlier crimes sound restrained. He has developed intricate scenarios for testing human reactions to prolonged psychological and physical torment, Harding reported in a sealed letter. If he is allowed to mature and gain resources, he will likely become one of the most dangerous individuals in American history. Timothy remained at Fulton for 18 months. During that time, strange incidents plagued the hospital. Elderly patients died suddenly, all of them after recent contact with Timothy. 2 young patients suffered fatal falls in areas Timothy had visited earlier. Others reported waking in the night to find the boys standing silently beside their beds, staring. Even the staff began to unravel. Nurses suffered recurring nightmares so vivid they requested transfers. 2 attendants refused to work near Timothy at all, claiming they felt watched even when the boy was locked in his room. The most chilling discovery came from Dr. Martha Fitzgerald. She found that Timothy had convinced a sympathetic nurse to give him paper and pencils for therapeutic writing. His journal appeared to be full of childlike remorse and earnest hope for redemption. But Fitzgerald, trained in European cryptographic analysis, noticed something strange. Hidden inside the innocent entries was a cipher. When she cracked it, the truth spilled out. The journal was not a record of healing. It was a blueprint. Timothy had been mapping the hospital, cataloging guard rotations, lock mechanisms, staff weaknesses. Each confession was paired with an experiment. Ways to test trust, ways to provoke fear, ways to watch how people responded to terror when they thought they were safe. He was planning something far worse than anything he had done on the farm.